I brought my granddaughter to my wife's office, a box of her favorite pastries in my hand. The receptionist stopped us cold. Her husband is inside. No interruptions. No exceptions. My hands went cold. I crouched down and placed both palms gently over my granddaughter's ears. Then I made one call. "Get here," I said. "Right now. No mercy." And just like that, everything I had built my life around was about to be accounted for. I'm truly thankful to have you with Dad's Revenge Stories. Which corner of the world are you watching from right now? Let me know your city down below. Please note, certain parts contain dramatized elements for entertainment and perspective. Any similarity to actual events is purely coincidental, yet the core message is deeply valuable. The box sat on my lap the entire drive down Wilshire Boulevard, and Lily kept reaching over from the back seat to touch the pink ribbon on top, like she was making sure it was still there. "Grandpa," she said, "do you think Grandma will share?" "She always shares with you," I told her, "but not with you." I watched the road and smiled. She shares in her own way. That was true enough. Diane had always been generous with what she wanted to give and careful with what she didn't. I had learned the difference over 29 years, the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark, by feel, by memory, by the occasional collision with something you forgot was there. The pastry box was from Roseline's on South Figueroa, the French bakery Diane had loved since before we were married. Almond croissants, 3 of them wrapped in wax paper and tied with that pink ribbon Lily had insisted on. We had driven 20 minutes out of our way for it. Lily had counted the money from her birthday jar herself, smoothing out each dollar bill on the car seat before handing it to the woman behind the counter. "Grandma is going to love them," Lily said, pressing her face to the window as the office buildings thickened around us. "She always says French pastry is the only kind worth eating." She does say that. Then we did good, right? We did real good, sweetheart. I pulled into the parking structure on the east side of the Caldwell Event Solutions building, 12 floors of glass and steel on Wilshire that Diane had leased 4 years ago when the company outgrew its first location in Culver City. I had helped her sign the lease. I had sat in the attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon and initialed every page while she squeezed my hand under the table and said quietly that none of it would have been possible without me. I believed her then. I had no reason not to. Lily unclipped her own seatbelt before I had the engine off. She was proud of that had been practicing, and waited for me at the elevator with the pastry box held flat in both hands, like she was carrying something sacred. "I got it," she said when I reached for it. "I know you do." The lobby was cool and bright, all polished marble and recessed lighting, the kind of space designed to make visitors feel that the people inside knew what they were doing. A young woman sat behind the reception desk with the posture of someone who had been trained to project confidence. She looked up when we came through the glass doors, and something crossed her face, something I could not immediately name. "Good afternoon," I said. "Walter Caldwell. I'm here to see my wife, Diane Caldwell." The receptionist's fingers moved to her keyboard, then stopped. She picked up the desk phone, pressed a button, and said something I could not hear. She listened. She set the phone down. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was careful in the way that voices get careful when someone has been given instructions they are uncomfortable carrying out. "Mrs. Caldwell is currently in a meeting and has asked not to be disturbed." "I understand she's busy," I said. "I'm not here for long. My granddaughter wanted to bring her something." Lily held up the pastry box with both hands, the pink ribbon forward, her expression earnest and open the way only a 7-year-old's expression can be. The receptionist's jaw tightened by a fraction. Her eyes moved from Lily to me and back to the telephone on her desk. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell is unavailable. She lowered her voice slightly. Her husband is inside with her. She was very specific. No interruptions. No exceptions. The lobby temperature was set somewhere around 68 degrees. I know because Diane had complained about the building's HVAC system every winter since they moved in, said it ran too cold, said she would have it adjusted. She never did. My hands went cold anyway. Personal guest, I looked down at Lily. She was watching me with her dark eyes, the pastry box still raised, the pink ribbon still neat. She did not understand what the receptionist had said. She understood that something had shifted, the way children always understand, that the way they feel it in the air before any adult confirms it. I crouched down to her level. I placed both of my palms gently over her ears. "Baby," I said, keeping my voice the way I had kept it through 30 years of business negotiations and hard conversations, and the kind of news that rearranges everything level steady, giving nothing away. "I need to make one quick call. You stay right here. Don't move from this spot." Lily nodded. She pulled the pastry box against her chest and held it there. I straightened up. I took my phone from my jacket pocket. I dialed my brother. Samuel kept one hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder so she could feel me there, and waited. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter." "Samuel." My voice came out quieter than I expected. Not shaking, just quiet. "I'm standing in the lobby of the Caldwell Event Solutions building on Wilshire. I came to bring Diane her afternoon pastry. The receptionist just told me Diane has a personal guest and left specific instructions, no interruptions, no exceptions." There was a pause. My brother had spent 31 years as a corporate attorney in Los Angeles. He had negotiated contracts worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He did not rattle easily. The pause was not rattled. It was the pause of a man organizing what he was hearing into its correct and serious categories. "Who is the guest?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "Are you all right?" I looked down at Lily. She had rested her chin on top of the pastry box and was watching a man in a gray suit cross the lobby. She was humming something faintly, some song from the radio she had not stopped humming for 3 days. "Get here," I said. "Right now. No mercy." Samuel said, "I'm already getting my keys." Lily was still humming when I put the phone back in my pocket. She had not moved from the spot I had pointed to, right beside the marble pillar near the elevator bank, far enough from the reception desk that the young woman behind it could pretend not to watch us. Lily had the pastry box resting against her hip, now one arm looped around it like a schoolbook. She was studying the lobby ceiling where the recessed lights made small, perfect circles against the white plaster. "Grandpa," she said, "how many lights do you think are up there?" "A lot. I count 43, but there might be more around the corner." "There might be." She looked at me then with those dark eyes that had always seemed to me too serious for a 7-year-old's face, the kind of eyes that filed things away quietly and retrieved them later when you least expected it. "Is Grandma coming down?" "Not today, sweetheart." Because of the meeting. Because of the meeting." She accepted this the way children accept things when they sense the adult is holding something back, not fully, not permanently, but enough to keep moving. She turned back to the ceiling and resumed her count in a whisper. I walked to the reception desk. The young woman looked up, and I could see the relief on her face that I was not about to make a scene, and beneath that relief, something that looked almost like guilt. She was doing her job. I understood that. She had been given instructions by the person who signed her paycheck, and she had followed them. That was not her fault. "Could you make sure Mrs. Caldwell receives these?" I set the pastry box on the desk. The pink ribbon looked very bright against the gray laminate. And this as well. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the small card Lily had made at the kitchen table 2 nights ago, a square of yellow construction paper folded in half with a bunch of hand-drawn daisies on the front. And Happy Wednesday Grandma written inside in the careful, oversized letters of a child who had recently learned that lowercase g's were harder than they looked. The receptionist took the card with both hands. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell." "Thank you," I said. "You've been very professional." I meant it. She blinked like she wasn't sure how to receive that. I went back to Lily and held out my hand. She took it immediately, shifting the pastry box to her other arm before remembering it was no longer hers to carry, then looking up at me with a question forming on her face. "We left it for Grandma," I said before she could ask. "She'll get it after her meeting." "Oh." She thought this over as we walked toward the glass doors. "Did you leave the card too?" "I left the card too." "Good." She nodded with the gravity of someone confirming that a business transaction had been conducted properly. "She'll like the daisies. I practiced them 4 times before I drew the real ones." "I know you did. I watched you." The afternoon heat hit us as the doors slid open, that specific Los Angeles heat of early August that presses down from above and radiates up from the sidewalk, at the same time, the kind that makes the air above the concrete shimmer if you look at it from the right angle. Lily pressed close to my side as we walked to the parking structure, and I kept my hand wrapped around hers. In the car, I buckled her in and turned the air conditioning on before I sat down myself. She had her stuffed rabbit Franklin, a gray lop-eared thing she had owned since she was 18 months old, and that was missing one eye from a washing machine incident last spring, pressed against her window, showing him the street. "Grandpa," she said. Why did the lady look at you like that?" I adjusted the rear-view mirror. "Like what?" "Like she felt bad." Lily stroked one of Franklin's ears with her thumb, a habit she had when she was working something out. "Like when I broke Connor's soccer trophy by accident and I felt bad, but I didn't want to say it." My chest tightened in a way I had not expected. I kept my eyes on the exit ramp and my hands steady on the wheel. "Sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't feel good about," I said. "And it shows on their face even when they don't mean it to." "Did someone make her do something she didn't feel good about?" "Something like that." Lily pressed Franklin's nose to the glass. "That's not very nice of whoever did it." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." I pulled out onto Wilshire and headed west toward home. The sun was dropping behind the buildings, painting the smog a color that Los Angeles does better than anywhere else. That deep amber and rose that makes even ugly things look briefly beautiful. I drove through it and thought about 29 years. About a woman who had cried at our kitchen table the night before we signed the papers to sell the machine shop, who had said she was sorry it had come to this, who had taken my face in both hands and told me that everything I had built was going to become something neither of us could imagine yet. She had been right about that last part. My phone buzzed in my jacket. Samuel, a text this time. I pulled the internal access log. "You need to see what she put in writing. Coming to you. 40 minutes. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. "Grandpa," Lily said from the back, "can we make macaroni tonight? The kind with the breadcrumbs. We can make whatever you want." "Breadcrumbs," she said firmly. "The crispy kind." "The crispy kind," I confirmed. She went back to showing Franklin the city sliding past the window, and I drove west into the amber light. And I did not let my hands shake until I was sure she was not watching. Samuel arrived at 7:14. I know the exact time because I had been watching the driveway from the kitchen window for 20 minutes, and the clock on the microwave read 7:14 when his headlights swept across the front wall. Lily was asleep by then. She had eaten her macaroni with the crispy breadcrumbs, taken her bath without argument, and gone down fast, the way children do after days that have quietly worn them out without their knowing it. I had the kettle on. Samuel walked in without knocking, the way he had walked into every place I had lived since we were boys, sharing a room in our parents' house in Torrance. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table, loosened his tie, and sat down. He did not say hello. He opened the briefcase and placed a single printed page in front of me. This was entered into the building's visitor management system at 9:47 this morning, he said. Standard protocol at Caldwell Event Solutions is that all front desk instructions are logged with a timestamp and the name of the authorizing party. I looked at the page. The font was small, and the language was the flat, bureaucratic language of internal memos, but the meaning was not flat at all. Visitor Protocol Update authorized by D. Caldwell, CEO, effective immediately. Richard Hale to be designated as Priority Guest, full executive access, no escort required, direct elevator authorization to 14th floor. In the event that an individual identifying himself as Walter Caldwell husband requests access front desk, is to advise that Mrs. Caldwell is unavailable and direct said individual to leave the premises. Reason given to visitor at front desk discretion. No exceptions. Image of Walter Caldwell attached for reference. I read it twice. Then I set it down and poured the hot water into the 2 mugs I had already prepared. I pushed one across the table to Samuel. She attached a photograph, I said. A recent one, taken at the company Christmas party last December. Samuel wrapped both hands around his mug. She planned this, Walter. This wasn't a decision she made this morning when she saw your name on the visitor log. She put this in writing weeks ago, maybe longer. I thought about the Christmas party. I had worn the dark green sweater Lily had picked out for me. Diane had straightened my collar before we walked in and told me I looked handsome. I had believed her because I had no particular reason not to. "Who is Patty Odom?" I asked. Samuel looked up from his mug. "What made you think of Patty?" "You mentioned her name last week, when Diane let her go. You said something about it not sitting right with you." Samuel set his mug down carefully. "Patty Odom worked as your personal administrator for 22 years. She managed every contract that came through the machine shop and then through the events company after Diane took over operations. When Diane restructured the administrative staff 6 months ago, Patty was the first one released." He paused. Patty did not leave empty-handed. I looked at him. "She kept copies," Samuel said. "Paper copies locked in a fireproof box in her home office in Glendale. Every original contract from the machine shop years, every vendor agreement, every document bearing your signature that was later incorporated into Caldwell Event Solutions' operating structure." He picked up his mug again. "I spoke with her this afternoon while I was driving over. She has been waiting for someone to ask." The kitchen felt very still. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights crossing the ceiling in a long arc. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the microwave changed from 7:22 to 7:23. "Why did she keep them?" I asked. "Because she worked for you for 22 years, Samuel said. And when they handed her a severance check and walked her to the elevator, she said she had a feeling she might need them someday." He looked at me steadily. "She said she thought of you when she packed that box. She said she hoped she was wrong about why she was keeping them." I stood up and carried my mug to the sink. I stood there with my back to Samuel and looked out the window at the driveway, where his car sat under the elm tree I had planted the spring after Connor was born. That tree was 38 years old. It had grown around a bend in its own trunk, where it had been tied to a stake when it was young, and now the bend was permanent part of its shape, something it had incorporated so completely that you would never know it had once been forced. "She put my photograph in the memo," I said. "She did. So the girl at the desk this afternoon, she would have recognized me from the image. She knew exactly who I was when I walked in." "Yes." I turned on the faucet and dried it, put it back on the shelf where it belonged. These were the kinds of things you did when you needed your hands to be doing something ordinary. "I want to meet with Patty," I said. "Can you arrange it?" "Already done. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, my office." Samuel closed his briefcase. "There's one more thing." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone, turned it face up on the table and pushed it toward me. On the screen was a photograph, a candid shot taken at what appeared to be a company gala, people in formal dress, glasses raised. In the foreground, slightly left of center, stood a man I did not recognize. He was perhaps 55, well-built, with the easy posture of someone accustomed to being looked at. He was smiling at something outside the frame. On his left wrist was my father's watch, the gold case, the brushed face, the slim profile that my father had worn every day for 30 years, and that I had worn for 11 years after him, until Diane told me she had knocked it from the bathroom shelf during the move to the new house, and it had shattered on the tile floor, and she was so terribly sorry. My fingers went cold against the side of the phone. "Who is he?" I asked, though I already understood the way you understand certain things before you are ready to say them out loud. "His name," Samuel said quietly, "is Richard Hale." Samuel left at 8:30. He squeezed my shoulder at the door, no words, just that, and I watched his taillights disappear down the street before I went back inside. I washed the 2 mugs again, even though I had already washed them. I dried them again. I put them back on the shelf and stood in the kitchen listening to the house. Lily's sound machine hummed softly from behind her closed door. The ocean setting, the one she had chosen herself 6 months ago, and had not deviated from since. I had bought her 3 different machines before she settled on that sound. She had tested each one with the seriousness of a scientist conducting trials, lying on her back on the floor with her eyes closed, while I sat on the edge of her bed and waited for her verdict. I was thinking about that, about the sound machine trials, about the particular gravity with which a 7-year-old approaches the question of what she wants to fall asleep to, when I heard Diane's car in the driveway. The garage door opened. The engine cut. Her heels crossed the garage floor in that specific rhythm I had known for nearly 3 decades. Quick, purposeful, the walk of a woman who moved through the world as though it owed her something and was perpetually behind on payments. She came in through the side door carrying her tote bag on one shoulder and the pink pastry box from Rosaline's in her other hand. She had taken it from the reception desk. She set the box on the kitchen island without looking at me, dropped her tote on the stool beside it, and opened the refrigerator. She stood in the cold light of it for a moment, scanning the shelves with the expression of someone who expected to be disappointed, and was. "There's leftover macaroni," I said. "Lily and I made it earlier." "I ate at the office." She closed the refrigerator. She picked up the pastry box and carried it to the island. She found a knife in the block by the stove, the good one, the German steel one I had sharpened 2 Sundays ago, and opened the box. 3 almond croissants in their wax paper, the pink ribbon curled to one side. She cut one of the croissants in half without ceremony and took a bite. She chewed slowly. Her expression shifted in a way I recognized, the particular downward pull at the corners of her mouth that meant she was preparing to deliver a verdict. "Rosaline's has gone completely downhill," she said. "This is cloyingly sweet. No balance. The almond paste is cheap, you can taste it." She set the half-eaten piece down on the marble. This is exactly the kind of pastry that people with no real palate think is sophisticated, cheap, and common. My granddaughter had saved birthday money for that box. She had smoothed each dollar bill on the car seat. She had carried it through the lobby with both hands like it was something sacred. I said nothing. Diane reached into the box for a second croissant, then seemed to decide against it, and pushed the box to the far side of the island. She picked up a paper napkin and wiped her fingers. That was when she noticed the yellow square of construction paper on the counter, Lily's card, which I had brought home from the lobby after leaving the original with the receptionist. I had made a second one with Lily that afternoon, a duplicate, because Lily had wanted to keep one for herself. Diane picked it up. She looked at the hand-drawn daisies on the front, opened it, read the 5 words inside Happy Wednesday. Grandma loved Lily, and closed it again. Then she rolled it between her palms slowly and deliberately until it was a compressed cylinder of yellow paper, and pressed it into the glass ashtray on the counter beside the fruit bowl. She pushed it down with her thumb until it sat at the bottom like something that had never been a card at all. My throat tightened so sharply that I had to set my hand flat on the counter to have something solid to press against. I thought about Lily at the kitchen table 2 nights ago, tongue pressed between her lips in concentration, restarting the G and Grandma 3 times until she was satisfied with how it looked. Diane picked up her tote bag. I have an early call tomorrow. I'm going up. Diane. She stopped. She did not turn around. Ma, she made that card herself, I said. She practiced the letters. A pause. The refrigerator hummed. From behind Lily's door, the ocean sound machine breathed its slow, repetitive rhythm. Walter. Her voice was the voice she used in board meetings when someone had said something she found beneath her time. I've had a 14-hour day. I don't have the energy for sentiment right now. She walked out of the kitchen. Her heels crossed the hardwood in the hallway. The stairs creaked in the familiar sequence: 3rd step, 6th step, 9th, and then the bedroom door closed. I stood at the counter for a long time. I looked at the ashtray, at the compressed yellow cylinder at the bottom of it. I thought about reaching in and smoothing it back out, but I knew it would not go back to what it had been. Some things don't unfold once they've been pressed that hard. I turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Lily. She was on her side with Franklin tucked under her chin, one small hand curled beside her face, breathing the deep and uncomplicated breath of someone who had not yet been asked to carry anything heavy. I stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. My phone buzzed on my hip. Samuel, a text message: Patty confirmed for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Also, I ran a search on Richard Hale. Walter. There is significantly more here than a watch. I typed back one word. Tell me. His reply came in under a minute, and I read it standing in the hallway outside my granddaughter's room while the ocean played softly on the other side of her door. And by the time I finished reading, my hand was not shaking. It was completely still. That was worse. The message Samuel sent me that night was 4 paragraphs long. I read it standing in the hallway outside Lily's room. Then I went to the kitchen, turned the light back on, sat down at the table and read it again. Then I turned the light off and went to bed and did not sleep for a very long time. Samuel had done what Samuel always did. When he suspected something, he had pulled every public record attached to Richard Hale's name and cross-referenced it against the Caldwell Event Solutions corporate filings he had been tracking for the past 3 months. What he found was not complicated. It was in fact very simple, which is often the way the worst things are. Richard Hale had been listed as a strategic consultant on 3 separate vendor agreements with Caldwell Event Solutions, dating back 22 months. His consulting fees across those agreements totaled $214,000. All 3 agreements had been signed by Diane in her capacity as CEO. None of them had been disclosed to the company's advisory board. None of them had gone through the standard vendor review process that the company's own operating procedures required. I lay in the dark of the guest room. I had moved to the guest room 8 months ago, a gradual drift that neither of us had formally acknowledged, and I thought about $214,000. I thought about what that number meant in the context of a company that I had capitalized with the proceeds from selling the machine shop. The machine shop my father had built from a single rented bay in a warehouse in Hawthorne in 1971. My father's name was George Caldwell. He had worked with his hands his entire life, first as a machinist, then as a shop owner, then as the kind of man other machinists called when they had a problem they could not solve. He was not a man who spoke often about what things meant to him. He showed you instead. He showed you by being at every Little League game, every school play, every early morning when you needed a ride somewhere and did not want to ask your mother. He showed you by handing you his watch on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 2001, 6 weeks before he died, and saying only, "This is what is left of everything I built. Do not lose it." I had worn that watch for 11 years. I called Samuel at 6:47 in the morning. He picked up on the first ring. "You didn't sleep. Tell me about the watch." A pause. "I spoke with a woman named Gloria Reyes. She works the coat check at the Biltmore and has been doing events for Caldwell for 3 years. She noticed the watch at the Winter Gala in January because her father had the same model, a 1968 Longines dress watch, gold-filled case, white enamel dial. She said the man wearing it told her it had been a gift from a close friend." My jaw tightened. "A gift?" "That's what he said." I stood at the kitchen window with the phone against my ear and looked at the elm tree in the driveway. The morning light was hitting it at a low angle, the kind of light that shows you every imperfection in a surface, every crack in the bark, every place where the wood had grown around something difficult. "Diane told me it fell off the bathroom shelf when we were moving," I said. "She said it shattered on the tile." "I know what she told you." "Ma," she cried, Samuel. "She sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried for 20 minutes about that watch." Samuel was quiet on his end of the line. Not the quiet of having nothing to say, the quiet of a man who understood that some things needed to be said out loud by the person they had happened to, and that the only respectful thing was to wait. "Then Dad gave me that watch 6 weeks before he died," I said. "He drove to my house on a Tuesday. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up with the watch in his shirt pocket, and he put it in my hand, and he said, 'Don't lose it.'" I looked at the elm tree. That was the last real conversation we had. 6 weeks later, he was in the hospital, and then he wasn't anywhere anymore. "Walter. I want to know how long she had been planning to give it away." "We may not be able to establish the exact timeline," Samuel said carefully, "but we can establish that she represented it to you as lost when it was not. That matters legally when we get to the asset documentation phase. Personal property misrepresentation in a marriage is—" "Samuel." My voice came out very flat. "I don't care about the legal framework right now. I just need 60 seconds where it's not a legal framework." A pause. Then quietly, "I know, I'm sorry." I turned away from the window. Lily's door was still closed. I could hear the ocean sound machine, faint and steady, still running from the night before. "She gave away the last thing my father ever put in my hands," I said. "She gave it to him. And then she sat on the edge of our bathtub and cried about it, and I held her hand while she did it." Samuel did not say anything. "Okay," I said. "Now it's a legal framework. What do I do next?" "Circusation. You come to my office at 10 o'clock, and you meet Patty Odom," Samuel said. And you let me show you the rest of what I found last night. Because the watch, Walter, as bad as it is, the watch is not the worst of it. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:51. 3 hours and 9 minutes. I put the coffee on, and I went to wake up Lily, and I made her scrambled eggs with the sharp cheddar she liked. And I listened to her tell me about a dream she'd had involving Franklin the rabbit winning a spelling bee. And I laughed in the right places, and I kept my voice completely even. And I did not tell her a single thing that was true about that morning. That was the hardest thing I had done in years. Patty Odom was already there when I arrived. She was sitting in the chair across from Samuel's desk, with a cardboard banker's box on the floor beside her feet, and a cup of coffee balanced on her knee. And when I walked in, she stood up immediately and held out her hand. She was a small woman, 52 years old, with reading glasses pushed up into her gray-streaked hair, and the kind of composed, watchful expression that comes from 2 decades of managing information other people preferred not to think about too carefully. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I'm glad you called." "Patty." I shook her hand. "I should have called sooner." "You didn't know you needed to." We sat down. Samuel closed the office door and took his place behind the desk, and for a moment the three of us occupied the particular silence of people who have arrived at the same destination by different routes and are taking a moment to confirm they are in fact looking at the same thing. Samuel opened a folder. "I'm going to walk you through this in order, Walter. I need you to let me finish before you ask questions." "All right," he began. 8 months ago, Diane had incorporated a new entity, Caldwell Premier Events LLC, registered with the California Secretary of State under her name alone. The stated purpose was event production and venue consulting. The capitalization was $3.1 million. Samuel placed the incorporation documents on the desk and turned them to face me. I looked at the figure. $3.1 million drawn from accounts I recognized. Accounts that had been funded over the course of our marriage by the proceeds of the machine shop sale, by years of reinvested revenue, by money that had moved through our shared life so long that I had stopped thinking of it as having originated anywhere specific. "That's marital property," I said. "In California, assets accumulated during a marriage are presumed to be community property, regardless of which spouse's name they're held in," Samuel said. "She used jointly held funds to capitalize a separately registered entity without your knowledge or consent. That is a material breach of fiduciary duty between spouses and potentially constitutes fraudulent transfer under California Family Code." He paused. "In plain terms, she took your money to build something she intended you to have no part of." Patty reached into the banker's box and produced a manila folder, which she set on the desk beside Samuel's documents. "These are the original client contracts," she said. "The ones Mr. Caldwell negotiated personally. I kept copies of every agreement signed during the machine shop years and the first 4 years of the events company." I opened the folder. The first page was a contract with Doug Mercer, Douglas R. Mercer Construction Group, a man I had known since we coached Little League together in 1996. The contract was dated 11 years ago. Doug had been one of my first events clients, had referred 7 other contractors to us in the first 2 years, had called me personally every time he needed something, because he said he trusted my word more than any written guarantee. The contract in my hand was the original. Below it was a second document, a transfer agreement dated 6 months ago, reassigning Doug Mercer's account from Caldwell Event Solutions to Caldwell Premier Events, LLC. Diane's signature was at the bottom. Mine was not. "She transferred his account without telling him," I said. "She transferred 41 accounts," Patty said. "All of them original clients from the machine shop network. All of them people who came to the business because of your relationships, your reputation, your name. She kept her voice level and professional, but her hands tightened slightly around her coffee cup. The total contract value across those 41 accounts is $4.7 million annually. $4.7 million. I set the folder down on the desk and looked at the wall behind Samuel's head. He had a framed photograph there, the two of us at our parents' house in Torrance, Christmas, 1983. Both of us in terrible sweaters, grinning like we had no idea what was coming, which we didn't. The warehouse, I said. Samuel nodded. He produced a third document, a property deed and accompanying loan satisfaction record. The Caldwell Warehouse and Equipment Complex in Commerce, 12,000 square feet of covered storage. The loading infrastructure, the specialized rigging equipment, was purchased in 2003 using proceeds from the sale of Dad's original machine shop in Hawthorne. Because it was purchased with funds derived from an inheritance, the machine shop itself having been willed to you specifically by George Caldwell. The property qualifies as your separate property under California Family Code, Section 770. He let that land. That means Diane has no legal claim to it, I said. Correct. It is yours individually. The agreement allowing Caldwell Event Solutions to use the facility was a verbal arrangement, later memorialized in a one-page document you signed in 2009, which I happen to have a copy of. Samuel opened his desk drawer and placed a single page on top of the pile. That agreement contains a termination clause. Either party may dissolve the usage arrangement with written notice. No minimum notice period is specified. The room was very quiet. I thought about the warehouse in Commerce, the smell of it, machine oil and cedar, and the particular dry heat of a California summer pushing through the loading bay doors. I had spent more hours in that building than in any other place on earth except the house I grew up in. I knew every bolt in the rigging system, every scuff on the concrete floor, every idiosyncrasy of the freight elevator that ran slightly slow on the left side. She built her entire operation on top of something that belongs to me, I said. Yes, Samuel said. And she did it assuming I would never look. Patty Odom set her coffee cup down on Samuel's desk very carefully in the way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally setting it down in the right place. Mr. Caldwell, she said, in 22 years I never once saw you stop looking. I saw other people assume you had. I picked up the termination clause document and read it through once slowly from the first word to the last. Then I folded it in half and put it in my jacket pocket. All right, I said. Let's make sure it stays that way. The credit card statement arrived in the mail on a Thursday afternoon. It came the way it always came. A white envelope with the bank's logo in the upper left corner addressed to both of us, Walter and Diane Caldwell. The two names printed side by side, the way they had been on every piece of shared mail for 29 years. I brought it in from the mailbox, along with a gardening catalog and a birthday card for Lily from her mother Ashley, who sent cards from Portland with reliable regularity even if she could not always manage phone calls. I set the gardening catalog on the counter. I set Ashley's card aside to give to Lily when she got home from her afternoon program. I opened the credit card statement at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read it the way I always read it, methodically, line by line, starting from the top. I got to line 7 before I stopped. The Whitmore Grand West Hollywood. 4 nights. $8,200. I read it again. Then I read the next line. Maison Girard, Beverly Hills. Dinner for 2. $640. Then the next. The Strand, Manhattan Beach. Dinner for 2. $480. Then Horological Reserve, Beverly Hills. One item, $4,100. I knew Horological Reserve. It was a watch boutique on Rodeo Drive that specialized in vintage and high-end timepieces. I had walked past it once and looked in the window and kept walking. It was not the kind of place you went to unless you were buying something for someone you wanted very much to impress. I took out my phone and opened the banking app. I entered my password. Incorrect password. Please try again. I entered it again carefully, this time one digit at a time. Incorrect password. Please try again. 2 attempts remaining. I set the phone face down on the table. The joint checking account, the joint savings account, the joint credit card. These had been the architecture of our financial life for nearly 3 decades. I had never had reason to feel locked out of them. The password I had just entered was the same one I had used for 6 years, the one we had set together sitting at this same table on a Saturday morning, when the bank upgraded their mobile platform and required everyone to reset their credentials. Diane had changed it. She had changed the password to the joint account without telling me, which meant she had done it deliberately, which meant she had anticipated that I might want to look. I picked up the phone and called Samuel. "The joint account password has been changed," I said when he answered. "I can't get in." A pause. "When did you try?" "Uta, 2 minutes ago." I also have the statement in front of me. $8,200 at the Whitmore Grand in West Hollywood. 4 nights. Dinner at Maison Girard. Dinner at the Strand. 4,100 at Horological Reserve in Beverly Hills. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Horological Reserve sells watches. Yes. Walter, the total on that statement, $31,400. I added it up. I looked at the statement on the table. Samuel, she changed the password. She was expecting me to look. Or she changed it as a precaution after you showed up at the office. Either way, either way, he agreed. I'll file a request for full account access through the joint account dispute process with the bank. As a joint account holder, you have a legal right to all statements and transaction records regardless of password. They cannot deny you access to your own account. He paused. There's something else I need to tell you. I heard back from the insurance broker this morning. I had asked Samuel 3 days ago to verify the health insurance policy Diane managed for us, a task she had taken over 4 years ago when she restructured the household accounts, saying it made more sense for the business to handle it. Tell me, I said. Talk to. Your current policy is a California minimum coverage plan through Pacific Shield, the most basic tier available, $200 deductible limited specialist access, no prescription coverage above generic tier 1. Samuel's voice was careful and even. The premium is $230 per month. I had given Diane $2,600 every month for our health insurance. She had told me the premium had gone up, that good coverage was expensive, that she was managing it. The plan she told me she had us on, I said. The Meridian Preferred Plan. What does that run per month? $2,630. The difference was $2,400 per month. I sat with that number for a moment. 14 months, Samuel had confirmed the switch had happened 14 months ago. $2,400 times 14 months. $33,600. I thought about the $4,100 watch from Horological Reserve. I thought about the 8 nights total across 2 hotel stays. I thought about the dinners. I thought about the prescription I had stopped filling 8 months ago because Diane had said the insurance no longer covered it and the out-of-pocket cost was too high, and we should ask the doctor for an alternative. Walter, Samuel said. Are you there? I'm here. Are you all right? Outside, a car turned into the driveway. The afternoon program van dropping Lily home. I watched through the window as the side door slid open, and Lily jumped down, backpack bouncing, and turned to wave at the driver the way she always did. She spotted me through the kitchen window and waved at me, too big and enthusiastic, both arms. I raised my hand and waved back. I'm all right, I told Samuel. Lily just got home. I'll call you tonight. I ended the call and stood up and went to open the front door, and I smiled when she came up the porch steps, and I asked her about her day. And she told me about a project involving papier-mâché animals, and I listened to every word. I was very good at listening. I had been practicing for 29 years. I called Richard Hale on a Friday morning, and he picked up on the third ring. I had gotten his number from Patty, who had it in the vendor contact file she kept in the banker's box in her home office in Glendale. I did not introduce myself on the phone. I simply said that I was calling on behalf of the Caldwell family regarding a business matter that required a brief in-person conversation, and that I would appreciate 30 minutes of his time at a location of his choosing. He suggested a coffee shop in Silver Lake. I told him that worked fine. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a table near the window where I could see the door. The place was the kind of Los Angeles establishment that had been there long enough to look effortlessly worn, mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, a chalkboard menu in handwriting that changed weekly. I ordered a black coffee and watched the morning foot traffic on Sunset Boulevard and thought about what I was going to say. Richard Hale walked in at 9:58. He was taller than I had expected from the photograph, 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from years of being the most presentable person in any room. He wore a well-cut charcoal blazer over a light blue shirt, no tie. His left wrist was bare. He scanned the room, found me, and walked over with the easy stride of a man who had been to a great many meetings and was not particularly worried about this one. He did not know yet that he should be. Mr. Caldwell. He extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who had been taught that confidence was communicated in exactly 3 seconds and not one more. Mr. Hale. I gestured to the chair across from me. Thank you for coming. He sat down and ordered an Americano from the server, who appeared immediately, then looked at me with the measured, pleasant expression of a man waiting to understand what he had walked into. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed 2 documents on the table between us. The first was our marriage certificate. Walter James Caldwell and Diane Louise Merritt married at the Los Angeles County Clerk's Office on March 14, 1996. The second was a current California DMV identification card bearing my photograph and my name. Richard Hale looked at both documents. He looked at them for a long time. The server brought his Americano. He did not touch it. She told me you were her cousin, he said finally. His voice had lost the easy confidence it carried when he walked in. What replaced it was something quieter and considerably more careful. She said your name was Walter. She said she described some cognitive and mobility issues, that you had been living with her on and off for years because you couldn't fully manage on your own. I let him finish. She was very specific about it, he continued, his jaw tightened by a fraction. She said your presence could be disruptive, that you sometimes showed up at the office because you forgot you weren't supposed to. She said the staff had been briefed to handle it gently. I picked up my coffee cup and took a drink. The coffee was good, dark and clean, no bitterness at the back of it. How long have you known her? I asked. 3 years. He said it the way you say a number when you have just realized it means something different than you thought it did. We met at a conference in San Diego. She introduced herself as the founder and CEO of Caldwell Event Solutions. A pause. She did not mention a husband. She rarely does, I'm told. Richard Hale looked at the marriage certificate on the table between us. His right hand moved toward his Americano wrapped around it, but he did not drink. Mr. Caldwell, I want to be clear with you about something. I was given a specific version of who you were and what your relationship to Diane was. I accepted that version because I had no reason not to and because... He stopped. Because she cried when she told it, I said. Something shifted in his face. Yes. She's very good at that. Yes, he said again more quietly. I'm beginning to understand that. We sat with that for a moment. Outside on Sunset, a city bus rumbled past, and the window vibrated slightly in its frame, and the sound of it filled the space where neither of us had anything immediately useful to say. The watch, I said. Richard set his cup down. His jaw moved. She gave it to me 8 months ago. She said it had belonged to a dear friend who had passed away, and that she wanted it to go to someone who would appreciate it. He reached up and touched his bare left wrist with his right hand, a reflexive gesture, the muscle memory of something that was no longer there. I should have asked more questions. You should have, I agreed. There was no point in being gentle about it. It belonged to my father. He gave it to me 6 weeks before he died. Richard Hale closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, they were different. Something had gone out of them that had been there when he walked in, some layer of assumption or comfort that would not be coming back. I'm sorry, he said. I mean that. I know you do. I gathered the 2 documents from the table and returned them to my jacket pocket. That's actually why I wanted to meet you in person, rather than communicate through attorneys. He looked at me steadily. What do you need from me? I told him. He listened without interrupting, which told me something about him. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, his Americano cooling in front of him. And then he nodded once, a single definite movement, the nod of a man making a decision he had already arrived at before his head went down. All right, he said. I stood and picked up the check before he could reach for it. One more thing, I said. Do you still have the watch? Yes. Keep it for now, I said. I'll let you know when I need it back. Outside, the morning was warming into that particular Los Angeles brightness that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is, or perhaps exactly as significant as it is. I walked to my car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number, Mr. Caldwell. My name is Janet Hale, Richard's ex-wife. I believe we have some things in common. I think it's time we talked. Janet Hale was not what I expected. I had formed some vague impression from her text message, precise. Controlled, the kind of person who chose words carefully and did not send messages she had not already revised at least once in her head. I expected someone formal, perhaps brittle. What walked into Samuel's office at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon was a woman of 53 with crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who had already done her grieving and come out the other side of it with her spine intact. She shook my hand. Then Samuels sat down and placed a tote bag on the floor beside her chair with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been carrying her own things for a long time and had gotten very good at it. Thank you for agreeing to meet, I said. Richard called me last night, she said. He told me what you showed him. He was, she paused, selecting the word with care. Unsettled, which for Richard is significant. He doesn't unsettle easily. She looked at me directly. We divorced 4 years ago. It was not a pleasant process, but we have managed to remain honest with each other, which is more than most people get. Another pause. When he described your meeting to me, I realized I had information you might find useful. She reached into the tote bag and produced a magazine. It was a glossy publication, the kind sold at upscale grocery checkout lanes and airport bookshops, the cover photograph carefully lit and carefully composed. Diane looked out from it in a cream blazer, her expression calibrated to project both warmth and authority. The smile of a woman who wanted you to believe she had worked very hard to get where she was, and that you could trust her completely because of it. The cover line read, "Built from nothing. How one woman refused to be held back." Patty Odom, sitting in the chair to my left, made a sound that was not quite a word. "I found it 3 months ago at my dentist's office," Janet said. "I read it in the waiting room. There is a passage on page 41 that I think you need to see." I opened the magazine to the page she indicated. The article was 4 pages long, illustrated with photographs of Diane at her desk. Diane at a gala, Diane laughing with a group of young women at what appeared to be a company retreat. I found the passage Janet had mentioned. Someone had placed a small pencil mark in the margin beside it. The paragraph read in the careful language of a journalist transcribing an emotional interview. Diane pauses here, her composure briefly giving way. She describes years of quiet resistance from a husband who did not share her ambitions, a man, she says, who saw her professional drive as a threat rather than a strength, who used financial control and domestic obligation to limit her options. Getting here, she says, required her to make choices that were painful and lonely, and that she would not wish on anyone. But she made them. And she is still standing. I read it twice. Then I closed the magazine and set it on Samuel's desk. "She sold the machine shop," Patty said. Her voice was very flat. "Walter sold the machine shop. He gave her every dollar of it. She did not have 2 cents of her own when they started." "I know," Janet said quietly. "That's why I'm here." Samuel leaned forward. "Mrs. Hale, is there anything else you brought?" Janet reached into the tote bag again and produced a USB drive which she placed on the desk beside the magazine. "Richard asked me to bring this. It contains email correspondence between Diane and Richard's former business partner, a man named Gregory Walsh, from approximately 16 months ago. The emails discuss the strategic value of Richard's consulting relationship with Caldwell Event Solutions. She paused. In 2 of those emails, Diane references her husband specifically. She describes him as her word decorative, a legacy fixture she is in the process of removing. The room was very still. I thought about the word decorative. I thought about 38 years of working with my hands. The machine shop, the warehouse, the rigging systems I had designed myself. The client relationships I had built one handshake and one kept promise at a time. I thought about George Caldwell in his rented bay in Hawthorne in 1971, building something from nothing, which is where the phrase had actually come from in this family. And it was not Diane. Samuel picked up the USB drive and turned it over in his fingers. "We'll need to verify the chain of custody on these emails before we use them formally. But as background intelligence, this is significant." He looked at me. "Walter, there's one more thing." Patty opened the folder on her lap and placed a printed spreadsheet on the desk. "This was in the shared drive under a folder labeled Operational Restructuring," she said. "I copied it the week before my last day. It's a termination schedule." I looked at the spreadsheet. It was organized by department, by hire date, by current salary. Names I recognized ran down the left column, men and women who had been with the operation since the machine shop days, who had shown up every morning for 15 and 20 years, because the work was reliable and because the man who ran the place treated them like they were worth something. Halfway down the first page, I found the name I was looking for. Tommy Reardon, Fleet Operations Manager, 22 years of service. Termination date September 1st. Tommy was 64 years old. He had driven a truck for me when driving trucks was what the job required, and then managed the entire fleet when the operation grew past what one man could physically do, and then trained every driver who came after him with the patience of someone who understood that the way you treated the people below you said everything about what you actually believed about the world. He did not know his name was on a list. He was showing up to work every morning thinking he had a job. "Call Tommy," I said. "Tell him to come to your office Monday morning. Don't tell him why." I looked at Samuel. "And Monday afternoon, I need you to draft the formal notice." "The termination of usage agreement for the warehouse." "Yes," Samuel nodded. He looked at me with the expression he had worn since we were boys, the one that meant he understood exactly what I was deciding and had already begun working out the details. "Once we file that notice, Walter shall know. There'll be no more quiet preparation. Everything accelerates." Janet Hale was watching me from across the desk with the calm, measuring look of a woman who had sat in a great many difficult rooms and learned to read them accurately. "Are you ready for that?" Samuel asked. I thought about the magazine cover. I thought about the word decorative. I thought about Tommy Reardon showing up Monday morning in the dark the way he always did, checking the tire pressure on every vehicle in the fleet before the day began, because that was the kind of man he was, and that was what the job deserved. "I stopped going back a long time ago, Samuel," I said. "Let's go forward." Sunday morning came in quiet and gray, the kind of overcast that Los Angeles does in August when the marine layer rolls in from the Pacific overnight and sits on the city until 10 or 11 before the sun burns it off. I was at the stove making oatmeal when the phone rang. Lily was still asleep. I had checked on her 20 minutes earlier. She was on her back with Franklin tucked under one arm and her mouth slightly open, the absolute boneless sleep of a child, with nothing pressing on her conscience. I looked at the phone on the counter. Connor. I turned the burner down and picked up. "Good morning," I said. There was a brief pause, the pause of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was now recalibrating because the person on the other end had not opened the way they expected. Connor had always done this even as a boy. He planned his arguments in advance and got slightly thrown when the conversation did not follow the anticipated route. "Dad." His voice was flat and deliberate, the voice he used in professional settings when he wanted to project control. I had heard it develop in him over the years, the way you watch a tree grow gradual, then suddenly unmistakable. "I'm calling because Mom reached out to me last night. She's upset. She says things have gotten complicated between you two and that you're not being reasonable about the situation." I stirred the oatmeal. "What situation is that, Connor?" "The divorce." He said the word with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided that treating it as ordinary would make it more manageable. "Dad, this has been coming for a long time. I think on some level you know that. Mom has built something real and significant, and she needs room to keep building it. You've been retired for 3 years. You're 68 years old." A pause that felt calculated. "There's no shame in stepping back." The oatmeal bubbled slowly at the edges. I turned the burner down another notch. "Your mother has been seeing Richard Hale for at least 3 years, I said. "She told him I was her cousin. She said I had cognitive problems and lived with her out of necessity." Silence on the line. Then, "Dad, she gave away your grandfather's watch, the one he put in my hand 6 weeks before he died. She told me she knocked it off the shelf and it broke. She gave it to Richard Hale and told him it was a gift from a dear friend." I don't knows anything about a watch. No, I know you don't. I took the oatmeal off the burner entirely and set the pot on the back of the stove. Connor, I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like you to think about it before you answer. Do you know where the money for your college tuition came from? A longer silence this time. Dad, that's not California State 4 years, then the MBA program at USC. Do you know where that money came from? From the family, he said, but his voice had shifted slightly, the professional flatness giving way to something less certain underneath. I sold equipment from the machine shop, I said. Piece by piece over 2 years while your mother was getting the events company off the ground, and the cash flow was inconsistent. I sold the CNC lathe first, because it brought the most. Then the surface grinders. Then the tooling inventory I'd built up over 15 years. I paused. I didn't tell you because you were 19, and you had enough to think about. But I'm telling you now. The line was very quiet. Connor, I said, keeping my voice the way I had kept it through the entire conversation level, not accusing, simply factual, the voice of a man describing things that had happened, rather than arguing about what they meant. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not asking you to be angry at your mother on my behalf. I'm asking you to make sure that what you know is accurate before you decide what's reasonable. Another silence. When Connor spoke again, the professional voice was gone entirely. What was underneath it was younger and less certain, and hearing it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Mom said you were making things difficult, he said. She said you were threatening the business. She said... He stopped. What did she say, Connor? A long pause. She said you were doing it out of spite. Because you felt left behind. I looked out the kitchen window at the elm tree. The marine layer was still sitting on the city flat and white, and the tree's leaves hung motionless in the still air. 38 years old, that tree. Bent around the thing that had once held it in place, the shape of the constraint now part of its permanent form. I built the foundation that company stands on, I said. I don't need to threaten it. I simply need to stop holding it up. Connor did not say anything. Tell me something, I said. Lily has been with me for 4 years. Connor, when did you last take her for a weekend? When did you last call her on a Tuesday just to ask about her day? The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. It was the silence of a question that had landed somewhere real. I've been busy, he said finally. His voice was very quiet now. I know you have. I pulled 2 bowls from the cabinet, one for me, one for Lily when she woke up. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand something. I am not the man your mother described to you, and I think some part of you already knows that. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Connor said in a voice that did not sound like a professional or a son delivering a prepared message, but simply like a 38-year-old man who had perhaps said the wrong things to the wrong person. Dad, The sound machine in Lily's room clicked off. The door opened. Small feet padded down the hallway. Connor, I said, I have to go. Lily's up. Call me when you're ready to talk. I'll pick up. I ended the call and turned to find Lily standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with Franklin dangling from one hand, her hair compressed flat on the side she had slept on. Grandpa, she said, was that Daddy? It was. Her face moved through something careful and hopeful. Is he coming to visit? I carried her bowl to the table and set it down. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Come eat your oatmeal before it gets cold. She climbed into her chair and picked up her spoon and did not ask again. Outside, the marine layer sat unmoving over the city, and I stood at the stove and thought about a 19-year-old boy who hadn't known where his tuition came from, and a 68-year-old man who had never told him, and all the distance that had grown in between. I dropped Lily at Ashley's apartment in Culver City at 11 that morning. Ashley Merritt met us at the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back with the look of a woman who had been up since 6, working on something she cared about. She was a graphic designer freelance, the kind of person whose apartment always had at least one wall covered in pinned reference images and color swatches. Lily ran to her immediately, and Ashley caught her and lifted her with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times and planned to do it 10,000 more. "Oh, she's been asking about the papier-mâché project," I told Ashley over Lily's shoulder. "We're finishing the giraffe today," Ashley said. She looked at me over the top of Lily's head with the careful assessing look she had used since the first time we met, the look of a woman taking the measure of the man who was raising her daughter. "Are you all right, Walter?" "I'm fine," I said. "I'll pick her up at 6. I drove back to the house on the east side, the one Diane and I had bought 21 years ago when the neighborhood was quieter, and the asking price was something a machine shop owner and a newly incorporated events coordinator could manage together. The marine layer had burned off by then, and the afternoon was bright and still in the particular way of Los Angeles in August, the air holding its heat without moving. I went inside to get my jacket. I was meeting Samuel at 3. I went upstairs. The door to what had been my room was ajar. I had left it closed that morning. I was certain of it, the habit of a man who had shared a house with a 7-year-old for 4 years and learned to keep doors either fully open or fully latched, nothing in between. I pushed it open. The smell reached me first. Fresh paint, the specific chemical sweetness of latex primer, the kind that takes 24 hours to cure fully. The walls were a shade lighter than they had been, a warm off-white that caught the afternoon light differently than the gray-blue I had chosen 7 years ago when we repainted the upstairs rooms. Someone had been in here with rollers and a drop cloth, and they had done it recently within the last 48 hours. The furniture was different. My dresser was gone. In its place stood a full-length mirror in a brushed chrome frame, angled to catch light from the window. A clothing rack had been installed along the wall where my bookshelf had been, the bookshelf I had built myself from, reclaimed Douglas, for the one that held the engineering manuals and the 3-volume history of American manufacturing my father had given me the Christmas I opened the machine shop. The rack held 6 suits in dry cleaning bags, all of them a size I did not wear. Along the windowsill, where I had kept Lily's drawing of the 2 of us at the beach, the one she had made last summer and presented to me with the gravity of a professional submitting a commission, there was nothing. The windowsill was empty and wiped clean. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked to the closet and opened it. My clothes were gone. My shoes were gone. The small cedar box where I kept my father's cufflinks, the ones I wore to the machine shop's 25th anniversary dinner, the ones my mother had given him on their wedding day, was gone. I went to the garage. 2 black trash bags sat beside the recycling bin tied at the top. I opened the first one. My shirts. My pants. The pair of dress shoes I had bought in 2019 for a client's retirement dinner. A framed photograph of Lily and me at Griffith Observatory, taken by a stranger who had offered the 2 of us squinting into the sun with the city spread behind us and Lily's arm around my neck. I stood in the garage for a moment with that photograph in my hand. Then I carried both bags to my car and put them in the trunk. I went back inside and walked through the downstairs rooms, the kitchen, the living room, the small study off the hallway where I kept the household files. Everything that had been mine. The reading lamp I used, the particular mug I preferred in the morning. The notepad I kept beside the telephone had been shifted, or removed in the subtle, systematic way of someone who was editing a space rather than clearing it, erasing a presence rather than packing a person up. I sat in the study for a while. The cedar box was not there. I called Samuel from the driveway. "The house has been reorganized," I said when he answered. "My things are in trash bags in the garage. My room has been repainted and fitted out as a dressing room. The photograph of Lily and me from Griffith Observatory was in a trash bag with my shirts." Samuel was quiet on his end. "I'm going to need a place to stay," I said. "The guest room has been ready for 2 weeks," he said. "I told you that." "I know you did." "Are you at the house now?" "In the driveway." "Leave the driveway, Walter. Come here. Bring your things." A pause. "And before you go, is there anything in that house that's irreplaceable?" Anything she might not have found yet. I thought about it. I walked back into the house through the kitchen and into the small coat closet near the side door where I kept the fireproof lockbox, a gray metal box 12 inches by 8, that had sat on the upper shelf behind the spare linens since the year we moved in. I reached up and found it by feel. Still there. Inside the original deed to the warehouse in Commerce. The original incorporation documents from the machine shop. My father's service record from the Navy. A photograph of George Caldwell at 23 standing in front of the first lathe he ever owned, grinning with the specific joy of a man who has just gotten his hands on exactly the tool he needed. I took the lockbox to my car and put it in the trunk next to the trash bags. I took one last look at the house from the driveway. 21 years of mortgage payments. The elm tree I had planted the spring after Connor was born. The porch railing I had replaced 3 times. The garden Lily and I had planted in the spring, the tomatoes still coming in red and heavy on the vine. I got in the car. My phone buzzed. "Richard Hale, Mr. Caldwell. Something happened this afternoon. I need you to know about it before tomorrow. Can we talk?" The bar Richard had chosen was on Vermont Avenue in Los Feliz, the kind of place that had been there since before the neighborhood became desirable. Low lighting, dark wood, a jukebox in the corner that played actual vinyl and required actual quarters. I arrived at 7:30. Richard was already there, sitting at a corner table with a glass of something amber in front of him that he had not touched. He was not wearing the charcoal blazer from the coffee shop. He was in a plain dark shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked like a man who had spent the afternoon sitting with something uncomfortable and had not yet found a position that made it easier. He stood when I approached. We shook hands. I sat down and ordered a club soda from the server, who materialized and disappeared with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that some tables needed space. "You said something happened," I said. Richard wrapped both hands around his glass without lifting it. "Diane called me this afternoon. She knew about our meeting at the coffee shop. I don't know how I didn't tell her, and I don't believe you did." "I didn't. Which means she has some way of knowing when I'm in contact with people she'd prefer I weren't." He looked at his glass. "She was not calm. She told me that you had approached me with falsified documents and that you were attempting to manipulate me as part of a scheme to defraud her of assets she had built independently." He paused. "Those were her words. Falsified documents. Scheme to defraud. And I told her I had seen the marriage certificate and that it did not look falsified to me." He finally picked up his glass and took a drink. "She told me I was being naive. That you were," she used the word, "cunning." She said elderly men who feel threatened can be surprisingly cunning. I looked at the jukebox in the corner. Someone had put on a Patsy Cline record, the needle finding the groove with a faint pop before the music started. The song was Crazy. I had always thought it was a song about love. Sitting in that bar on that particular evening, I was revising my interpretation. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I needed time to think." Richard set his glass down. "And then I called Janet. Your ex-wife. She's been the most consistently honest person in my life for 20 years, including the 4 since we'd divorced." He said it without self-pity, the statement of a man who had done his accounting and arrived at an accurate number. "Janet told me what she brought to your brother's office. The emails, the magazine." He looked at me directly. "I want you to know that I did not know about the article. If I had known she was saying those things publicly describing her husband in those terms, I would have asked different questions a long time ago." "What questions?" "The obvious ones." He turned his glass slowly on the table. "When someone presents you with a version of their life that makes them entirely the victim, and everyone around them entirely the obstacle, the correct response is skepticism. I know that. I teach that in the consulting work I do." He exhaled. I did not apply it here because I did not want to. There was no point in making him feel worse about that than he already did. "She's very good at creating the conditions where you don't want to look," I said. "I spent 29 years not looking at certain things." Richard nodded. "She called the warehouse this afternoon." I looked at him. "She called the facility manager directly, a man named Tommy Reardon, I believe. She told him that effective immediately, all scheduling and access decisions for the facility would go through her office exclusively, and that he was no longer to take direction from anyone identifying themselves as Walter Caldwell or Samuel Caldwell." Richard watched my face as he said it. "Mr. Reardon told her he would need to see something in writing from the facility owner before he changed any of his operating procedures. She told him the facility owner was the Caldwell Event Solutions Corporation. He told her he would need to verify that." Richard paused. "She hung up on him. Tommy, 64 years old, 22 years of showing up tire pressure checks before dawn, and when Diane called to tell him to lock me out of my own building, he had asked to see it in writing." My throat was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Tommy's a good man," I said. "He seemed like it." Richard reached into the inside pocket of his dark shirt and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "This is a printed copy of an email Diane sent to her attorney last week. Janet obtained it through her own divorce attorney. There was a document request still active from a related matter. The email discusses the warehouse." He paused. "She refers to it as a company asset. She instructs her attorney to begin preparing documentation to support that characterization." I unfolded the paper and read it. It was a single paragraph sent at 11:47 at night, the hour of decisions made with the particular recklessness of someone who believes they are too far ahead to be caught. "She believes the warehouse is hers," I said. "She has believed it for a long time," Richard said. "I think she stopped distinguishing between what she had built and what she had been given. At some point, those two things merged into her mind, and she could no longer see the seam." I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket next to the termination clause document from Samuel's desk. The pocket was getting full. "Richard," I said, "the night of the gala, the 22nd. Are you planning to attend?" He looked at me steadily. "I was planning to. Diane asked me to accept a formal role that evening, a title, in front of the guests." His jaw tightened. "I have not confirmed or declined yet." "I'd like you to attend," I said. "And I'd like you to bring the watch." Richard was quiet for a moment. The Patsy Cline record ended and the jukebox clicked and found the next one, something slower, something I did not immediately recognize. The amber light caught the edge of Richard's glass and held it. All right, he said. I stood and picked up the check. One more thing, I said. Tommy Reardon, he's on a termination list. September 1st. I looked at Richard. He asked to see something in writing before he changed his procedures. Tell me in your professional assessment what kind of man does that. Richard looked up at me. The kind worth keeping, he said. Yes, I said. He is. I walked out into the Los Feliz night, and behind me, the jukebox played on, and the amber light stayed where it was. And Richard Hale sat alone at his corner table with his hands around his glass. A man in the slow process of understanding what he had walked into, and what, if anything, he could do about it now. Samuel made coffee the way our mother had taught us both. Ground beans, stovetop percolator, no shortcuts. And he set a mug in front of me, without asking, because after 68 years, he knew I would want one. And after 65 years, he knew how I took it. I had been staying in his guest room for 2 nights. The room was small and quiet, with a window that looked out onto the backyard garden Samuel's wife Margaret had planted before she passed 7 years ago. Now the roses still coming back every spring the way she had always said they would. I had slept better in that room than I had in my own house in longer than I could honestly calculate. Samuel sat across from me at the kitchen table with his own mug and his laptop open beside it. Brenda Moss called me last night, he said. She's the journalist who wrote the magazine piece. I know who she is. She's been doing some additional digging since Patty reached out to her with the financial documents. She sent me something this morning that I think you need to see. He turned the laptop to face me. On the screen was a photograph, or rather a side-by-side comparison of 2 photographs. On the left was the original a family portrait taken at our parents' house in Torrance at Christmas 1989. I recognized it immediately. I was 31 in a dark green sweater. Diane was 29, standing beside me in a red dress. Connor was not yet born. We were at the beginning of things, and you could see it in our faces, the specific hopefulness of people who believe the story they are in is a good one. On the right was the edited version. I was gone. The image had been cropped and digitally altered with enough skill that the gap where I had stood was now occupied by the edge of the fireplace and a portion of the Christmas tree, as if I had never been there at all. Diane stood alone in her red dress, smiling at something outside the frame. She's been doing this systematically, Samuel said. Brenda found 17 images that have been altered. Wedding photos, holiday photos, the photograph from the machine shop opening in 1991. He paused. They're being used in a digital presentation Diane is preparing for the gala. A retrospective of the company's history. The history, as she's telling it, begins with her. I looked at the side-by-side photographs on the screen. I looked at the space where I had been standing. The Christmas tree filled it very neatly. Whoever had done the editing had been thorough. She had someone do this professionally, I said. Brenda thinks so. The alterations are too clean for amateur work. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the machine shop opening the photograph Samuel was describing, the one from 1991. I had been 33 years old. The shop had taken 4 years to build from nothing, 4 years of 7-day weeks, and borrowed equipment and clients I had found by driving to job sites and introducing myself to foremen. In the photograph, I was standing in front of the bay door in my work clothes, because I had come straight from a job, and I was grinning in the unself-conscious way of a man who has just done something he did not entirely believe he could do. Diane had not been there that day. She had been at a conference in San Francisco. My phone rang. The number was one I recognized, but rarely saw my sister Carol calling from her house in Pasadena, where she had lived for 30 years with her husband and a rotating population of rescue dogs and strong opinions. Walter. Her voice was tight in a way that Carol's voice almost never was. Carol was the most unflappable person I had ever known, a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and still showed up to family functions with homemade pie and a willingness to listen to anyone. When Carol's voice went tight, something had genuinely gone wrong. I need to tell you about last night. Tell me. Diane organized a dinner. At Rossetti's in Brentwood, the private dining room. She invited the whole family. Both sides. Your cousins from Riverside, the Hendersons' Aunt Patricia. A pause. She did not invite you. I didn't know that until I arrived and you weren't there, and I asked Diane where you were and she said you had chosen not to come. I looked at Samuel across the table. He was watching me with the still, careful expression of a man who already knew what Carol was about to say and had been waiting for me to hear it from someone who had been in the room. Connor spoke, Carol said. He stood up and gave "It was prepared, Walter." He had notes. He talked about Mom's journey and her sacrifices and the difficulties she had faced in the marriage. He said you had been an obstacle to her growth for years. He said the family should support her in this transition. Her voice cracked slightly at the edges, the way Carol's voice cracked when she was angry rather than sad, a distinction I had learned to recognize over 60 years of being her brother. Then Diane's attorney passed around a document, a statement of family support for the divorce proceedings. They asked everyone to sign it. Did anyone sign it? Some did. A pause. I did not. I stood up and I said that I had known you for 68 years, and that what Connor had just described was not the man I knew, and that I would not put my name on a document that treated your absence as agreement. Another pause, shorter. Connor told me I didn't understand the situation and suggested I leave. My jaw tightened. Connor had told my sister, a woman 20 years his senior, a woman who had babysat him when he had the chicken pox at age 6, and Diane and I had both been working to leave a dinner table because she would not sign a piece of paper against her brother. Carol, I said, thank you for telling me. Walter, are you all right? Where are you staying? I'm at Samuel's. I'm fine. You are not fine, she said with the brisk certainty of an older sister who had been accurately diagnosing the emotional states of people who claimed to be fine for her entire adult life. But you will be. I know you. A pause. What do you need from me? I thought about it. Nothing right now. But when the time comes, I may need a witness. I'll be there, she said immediately. No hesitation, no qualification. Call me day or night. I ended the call and set the phone on the table and looked at the laptop screen at the Christmas photograph with the neat professional absence where I had once stood. Samuel was quiet, waiting. The gala is 9 days away, I said. Yes. I want to be ready. I picked up my coffee mug. All of it, Samuel, every document, every photograph, everything Brenda has found, and everything Patty kept, and everything Richard brought. I want it organized and ready. Samuel nodded once. It already is, he said. I started the night you called me from the lobby. Outside the kitchen window, Margaret's roses were doing what they always did in August, blooming past what seemed reasonable, past what the heat should have allowed, insisting on it anyway. Lily found the dress in the bag I had brought from Samuel's guest closet. I had packed it 2 weeks earlier. The white dress with the embroidered daisies along the collar and hem, the one Lily and I had spent a long Saturday afternoon finding at the shop on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena. Lily had tried on 4 dresses that afternoon, before settling on this one, turning in front of the fitting room mirror with the critical concentration of a person who understood that some decisions deserved full attention. She had chosen it specifically for her grandmother. She had said with the conviction of a child who has thought something through completely that the daisies were exactly the kind of flower her grandmother would like because they were cheerful without being too much. I had kept the dress in the bag because I had not known what to do with it. I had not had the heart to explain to Lily why we would not be delivering it. She found it on Thursday morning while I was making breakfast, and she pulled it out of the bag and held it up, and her face opened into the specific joy of rediscovering something she had set aside and not forgotten. "Grandpa," she said, "we never gave Grandma her dress." "No," I said. "We didn't. Can we take it today? Her party is soon. She should have it before the party." I looked at Lily standing in the kitchen doorway of Samuel's house in her pajamas, holding the white dress with both hands, the embroidered daisies catching the morning light coming through the window. She was 7 years old. She had saved the dress because she wanted to give her grandmother something she had chosen herself. She had no knowledge of memos or lockboxes or termination clauses or any of the architecture of what had been happening around her for 2 weeks. She knew only that she had a dress she wanted to give and that we had not given it yet. "All right," I said. "We'll go this morning." We drove to the house on Ellendale Place. Lily held the dress across her lap the whole way, smoothing the skirt periodically with her palm to keep it from wrinkling. She had put on her good shoes without being asked. She had brushed her hair. She sat in the back seat with Franklin tucked beside her and the dress across her knees, and she hummed something low and tuneless content in the way of children who are moving toward something they expect to be good. Diane's car was in the driveway. I parked at the curb. We walked to the front door. I rang the bell. Lily stood beside me with the dress held out in front of her in both hands, her chin up ready. The door opened. Diane was dressed for the office-fitted blazer dark slacks, the particular armor of a woman who had somewhere important to be and did not intend to be delayed. She looked at me first, then at Lily, then at the dress Lily was holding. Something moved across her face that I could not immediately name. It was not warmth. It was not surprise. It was something harder and more impatient, the expression of someone who had organized her morning around a specific set of events and was now looking at an interruption she had not scheduled. "Grandma," Lily said, stepping forward slightly, holding the dress out further. "We got this for you. For your party. Grandpa and I picked out the daisies because I thought you would like them." Diane looked at the dress. She reached out and took it from Lily's hands. For one moment, one single moment that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and that I will not forget for the rest of my life, I thought she was going to take it inside. I thought some instinct would surface, some residual tenderness for the child who had saved birthday money and smoothed dollar bills on a car seat and stood at a fitting room mirror choosing flowers. She dropped it, not set it down. Dropped it. Let it fall from her hands onto the porch floor the way you drop something you have no use for and do not intend to pick up. Then she stepped onto the porch, and she raised her right foot, and she brought the heel of her shoe down onto the center of the dress. Once. The embroidered daisies compressed under the heel, and the fabric pulled and distorted in a way that fabric does when it is not meant to be treated that way. She did it again. Lily made a sound that I had never heard from her before, and hoped never to hear again, a sharp, high intake of breath that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but was the sound of a child absorbing something she did not have the framework to process. Her small hands came up to her own chest, pressing against it, and her chin began to tremble with the visible effort of a person trying to keep something inside that was too large to keep inside. "Take this child," Diane said, and her voice was the flat, cold voice she used in board meetings when she had already made a decision and was not interested in discussion. "And do not bring her to this door again without calling first. I have a company to run." She went back inside. The door closed. I did not look at the door. I looked at Lily. Her chin was shaking. Her eyes were filling the slow, helpless filling of a child whose body has decided before her mind has caught up. And when the first tear came, it came silently running straight down her cheek without any sound to accompany it. And then the second one. And then she pressed both fists against her eyes, and the sound that came out of her was the sound that broke something in my chest that I do not think has fully repaired itself since. I went to one knee on that porch. I put both arms around her and pulled her against me and held her while she cried. Really cried, the full-body crying of a child who has been hurt by someone they trusted to be safe. And I kept my hand on the back of her head. And I said her name quietly, and I said it again. And I let her cry until the worst of it had moved through her. And what was left was the ragged, exhausted breathing of someone coming back to the surface. I picked her up. She wrapped her legs around my waist and buried her face in my shoulder and held Franklin against my neck with one hand. I left the dress on the porch. I carried Lily to the car. I buckled her in. I walked around to the driver's side. I sat down. I put both hands on the wheel. I did not start the engine for a long time. When I finally took my phone from my pocket, my hands were completely steady. I opened Samuel's contact. I typed 7 words. Pull everything. Leave nothing behind. Start tonight. I pressed send. Then I started the engine, and I drove my granddaughter away from that house. And I did not look in the rearview mirror once. Samuel filed the written termination notice at 8 o'clock Friday morning. Under California law, a usage agreement without a specified term can be dissolved by either party through written notification delivered to the other party's last known business address. Samuel had prepared the notice 3 days earlier, a single page, clean and precise, the kind of document that says everything it needs to say without one unnecessary word. He sent it by certified mail to Caldwell Event Solutions on Wilshire Boulevard and emailed a copy simultaneously to Diane's attorney of record. He called me when it was done. "It's filed," he said. "Tommy has the authorization." Tommy Reardon had come to Samuel's office Monday morning, as I had asked. He had sat in the same chair where Patty Odom had sat with her banker's box, and Samuel had walked him through the property deed and the original usage agreement and the termination clause, and Tommy had listened to all of it without interrupting, the way Tommy did everything thoroughly without wasted motion. When Samuel finished, Tommy had said only, "Tell me what you need and when you need it." He had not asked about his own job. He had not mentioned the termination list. He had simply asked what needed to be done. By 5 o'clock Friday morning, Tommy and his crew had moved every piece of equipment belonging to Walter Caldwell out of the Commerce facility. The specialized rigging systems, the lighting inventory, the sound equipment. The fleet of transport vehicles, 11 trucks of various sizes, every one of them titled in Walter's name, every one of them now parked in a secured lot in Monterey Park that Samuel had arranged. The warehouse doors were locked. A notice was posted. The facility that had been the operational heart of Caldwell Event Solutions for 14 years was, as of 5:14 in the morning, inaccessible to anyone without Walter Caldwell's explicit written authorization. Samuel called me at 8. By 8:15, Diane's office had called Samuel's office 4 times. I was not there for any of it. I was driving to Ellendale Place. I had left a book at the house. A specific book, a worn, paperback copy of a John Steinbeck novel my father had given me when I was 17, with his handwriting in the margins. Notes he had made while reading it. Questions he had written to himself in pencil in the white space beside paragraphs that had struck him. I had left it on the shelf in the study because I had not thought of it when I packed, and I had thought of nothing else since. I let myself in with my key, the lock had not been changed yet, and went to the study. Richard Hale was in the living room. He was standing at the bookshelf with a glass of water in his hand, in the particular posture of someone making themselves at home in a space they have decided belongs to them. He turned when I came in. For a moment, neither of us moved. To Mr. Caldwell. His voice was different from the bar in Los Feliz, different from the coffee shop in Silver Lake. It was the voice of a man in a position he had decided to defend. "This isn't a good time." "I left a book," I said. "I'm here to get it." I walked past him toward the study. He stepped sideways, not quite blocking the hallway close enough to make the intention clear. I went around him. The book was on the shelf where I had left it. I took it down and held it. My father's handwriting in the margins, pencil gone soft with years. I stood there for a moment with it in my hands. Behind me, I heard Richard move. Then I heard something hit the floor, a small sound, a light impact. I turned. He had taken the framed photograph from the hallway table, the one of Lily and me at Griffith Observatory. The duplicate I had not taken because I had thought it was safe there, and dropped it face down on the hardwood. The glass had not broken, but the frame had come apart at one corner. "You should finish getting your things," Richard said, "and go." I walked back to the hallway. I crouched down and picked up the photograph. I checked the glass. I pressed the corner of the frame back together. Richard stepped forward. He put his hand on my shoulder, not a grip, a push, the specific pressure of a man asserting that he was larger and that this should mean something. I straightened up. He hit me, an open-handed strike, his palm connecting with the left side of my face, hard enough to turn my head. The sound of it in the hallway was very loud. My ear rang. My vision went briefly white at the edges. I stood straight. I looked at Richard Hale. I did not say anything. I held the photograph in one hand and my father's book in the other, and I looked at the man who had just struck me in the hallway of the house I had paid for, and I did not move, and I did not speak, and I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing anything on my face that he could use. From the front door, I had left it open behind me, came a small sound. I turned. Lily was standing in the doorway. Ashley had texted me that morning that Lily had left Franklin at my house during last week's visit and was upset about it, and could I check? I had forgotten to reply, had left the phone in the car. Lily had convinced Ashley to drive her over. She was standing in the open doorway in her weekend clothes with Franklin clutched against her chest, and her eyes moving between me and Richard and the ringing silence of the hallway. Her face had the particular stillness of a child absorbing something that does not compute. I went to her immediately. I crouched down in front of her, and I put both hands gently on her face, and I looked directly at her eyes, and I said, "Grandpa is fine, sweetheart. Everything is fine. Let's go find Franklin." Her lower lip was trembling. "Did that man hurt you?" "I'm fine," I said. "I promise." "Where did you leave Franklin?" She pointed toward the kitchen. I walked her there, found the rabbit on the window seat where she always left him, and pressed him into her arms. Then I walked her out the front door to where Ashley was waiting at the curb, her face tight with the alarm of a woman who had heard something from the driveway that she had not wanted to hear. I handed Lily to Ashley. "Take her home," I said quietly. "I'll call you in an hour." I went back to the car. I put the book on the passenger seat. I put the photograph on top of it. I sat for a moment. Then I took out my phone and sent Samuel one message. "It has escalated. Move the timeline up." All of it. That evening, Connor knocked on Samuel's front door. He stood on the porch with a key in his hand and could not look me in the eye. "Mom changed the locks this afternoon," he said. "She asked me to give you the new key." She said, you have 48 hours to collect whatever's left. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about a boy with the chicken pox at age 6, burning with fever, calling for me in the night. I thought about the CNC lathe I had sold first, because it brought the most money. I took the key from his hand. I turned it over once. Then I pressed it back into his palm and closed his fingers around it. Keep it, I said. I won't be needing it. Connor stood on the porch with the key in his closed hand and did not say anything. And for the first time since this had all begun, I saw something move across his face that looked unmistakably like shame. Shakticham, before I reveal the exact moment all the evidence was laid bare in front of 500 people, leave a no mercy in the comments below, so I know you're still here with me. Please note, the rest of this story includes fictional elements. If you'd rather not listen further, you may close the video at this point. The call came at 3:17 in the afternoon. Samuel forwarded it to me as a voicemail, Diane's office manager, voice tight and climbing, informing Samuel Caldwell that there appeared to be a serious logistical issue with the commerce facility, and that Mrs. Caldwell required an immediate callback to resolve what was surely a misunderstanding. Samuel did not call back. By 4 o'clock, 3 of Diane's contracted vendors had notified her event coordinator that they could not access the loading dock or the equipment inventory. The caterer called, the lighting company called, the staging contractor called, and then called again. The gala, 500 guests, the Biltmore Ballroom, a keynote and a formal dinner, and a retrospective presentation that had taken 6 weeks to produce, was running at roughly 20% of its required operational capacity, with 4 hours until the doors opened. Tommy Reardon texted me at 4:12. Everything secured. Nobody gets in without your signature. His name in my phone, 22 years of it, and he had not asked a single question I hadn't already answered. I was in the guest room at Samuel's house, standing in front of the mirror, in my shirt and trousers, working on my tie. The tie was dark navy, the one I had worn to the machine shop's 25th anniversary dinner. I had worn it 3 times in 11 years. It still held its shape. Patty knocked and opened the door halfway. She held the USB drive between 2 fingers. Everything's on here, she said. Contracts, the memo from the lobby system, the insurance documents, the photograph comparisons Brenda compiled, the email Diane sent her attorney at 11:47 at night. She paused. And the hallway recording. The hallway recording. The week after Diane had told Walter he was decorative, she had conducted a phone call in the ground floor hallway of the Wilshire office building, a semi-public corridor accessible to building staff, in which she had described in specific and unhurried terms her plans for the warehouse, her assessment of her husband, and her confidence that he would not look closely enough to see any of it coming. A building maintenance worker had recorded it on his personal phone because he had found the content of the call striking. He had given the recording to Patty 3 days ago. The hallway is a semi-public space, Samuel said from the doorway behind Patty. No reasonable expectation of privacy. It's clean. I took the USB from Patty and put it in my jacket pocket. Samuel looked at me. He was already dressed, dark suit, white shirt, the silver tie he had worn to his bar exam results dinner 40 years ago. He wore it, he had told me once, whenever something important was about to be decided. Walter, he said. Are you ready? I looked at myself in the mirror. 68 years old. Gray at the temples and through. The same hands that had run a machine shop and planted an elm tree and held a 7-year-old girl while she cried on a porch in August. I finished the knot on my tie. I've been ready, I said, for a long time. The Biltmore Ballroom held 500 people, and every seat was filled. Diane was at the podium when we walked in. Samuel on my left, Tommy holding the door. She was in the middle of a sentence about vision and perseverance and building something from nothing, and the room was listening the way rooms listen when they believe the person speaking has earned the right to be heard. The doors opening turned heads, then more heads. Then the room began to shift in that particular way of 500 people recalibrating simultaneously. Diane saw me when I was halfway down the center aisle. I watched her face move through 4 things in under 2 seconds. Recognition, calculation, fear. Then the performance of composure, which is the thing that replaces composure when the real version is no longer available. I reached the front of the room. Samuel stepped to the audio panel where Tommy was standing. The USB went in. Diane's voice filled the ballroom, the hallway recording clean and clear every word she had said in that semi-public corridor about her husband, about the warehouse, about the man she was in the process of removing. The room went completely still. When it ended, I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the folder of documents on the table in front of her. The warehouse deed, the original incorporation papers, the insurance records, the altered photographs beside the originals printed side by side. Then I removed my wedding ring. I set it on the table in front of the microphone. The sound it made was very small. In that silent room, it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I looked at Diane. "I'm returning everything to you," I said. "The company you built, the story you told, all of it. I want none of it back." Richard Hale stood up from the third table. He reached into his jacket and removed my father's watch. He set it on the table beside my ring without a word and walked toward the exit. Doug Mercer stood up next. He looked at me across the room, nodded once, and followed Richard toward the door. Then others. One by one, then in groups, the chairs emptying the way a tide goes out gradually and then all at once. Diane stood at the podium alone. I turned and walked back up the center aisle. Samuel fell into step beside me. The doors opened ahead of us, and the August night air came in warm and dry, carrying the faint smell of the city. I did not look back. The night after the gala, I sat in Samuel's kitchen until 2 in the morning and did not say very much, and Samuel sat across from me and did not require me to. That was the thing about Samuel. He had always understood that some things needed to be sat with before they could be spoken about, and that the sitting was not wasted time, but necessary time, the way you have to let concrete cure before you put weight on it. The following weeks moved the way the aftermath of things always moves, not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of smaller ones, each arriving with its own weight. Brenda Moss published her piece 11 days after the gala. It ran online first, then in print, 4,000 words with documentation. She had the altered photographs side by side with the originals. She had the vendor contracts and the incorporation filings and the insurance records. She wrote it the way good journalists write difficult things factually, without editorializing, letting the documents speak in the voice that documents have when they are allowed to speak plainly. The response was not immediate. It rarely is, but it was steady and it was significant. Doug Mercer called me the morning the article went live. He said 3 words before I could say anything: "I'm with you." He had already contacted Samuel about transferring his accounts. By the end of that week, 14 of the original 41 clients had initiated the process of returning to the network they had started with. By the end of the following week, it was 23. Tommy Reardon had kept the fleet maintained and the warehouse secured through all of it. When I asked him what I owed him for the extra weeks, he told me he had kept a log and that Samuel had the numbers and that we would sort it out when things settled. Then he said that his crew had been asking about hours and could he tell them something. I told him to tell them they had work for as long as they wanted it. He said that was what he figured and that he would let them know. The divorce was finalized in the second week of December. California law requires a minimum of 6 months from the date of filing before a dissolution of marriage can take effect. I had filed in late June, just over 6 weeks before the afternoon. I walked into the lobby of the Wilshire building with a pastry box and my granddaughter's hand, which meant that some part of me had known or had been willing to begin knowing before I was ready to say so out loud. The decree came through on a Thursday. Samuel called me when it was done. I was in the backyard of the new house in Pasadena, turning the soil in the garden bed, where Lily and I had decided we would plant tomatoes in the spring. I listened to Samuel, thanked him, and went back to the garden. Connor called 2 weeks after the gala. He did not apologize directly, he was not yet capable of that, or perhaps he was still working his way toward it. But he called, and he stayed on the line, and he asked about Lily. He asked what she had been doing, whether she was settled in the new house, whether she liked her room. I told him about the pale yellow she had chosen for the walls. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that yellow was always her favorite color. I said that I knew. He said he was going to try to come out in the new year. I said the door would be open. We left it there, which was more than we had managed in a long time, and less than I hoped we would eventually manage, and exactly as much as was honest for that particular moment. Lily had been in the new house since September. She had unpacked her own room with the systematic thoroughness she brought to projects. She cared about placing Franklin on the pillow first, and then arranging everything else around him as the fixed point. She had planted bulbs in the side garden with me in October, patting the soil down with both palms after each one, and asking me how long until they came up. I told her spring. She had accepted this with the patience of someone who understood that some things required waiting, and that waiting was not the same as nothing happening. December came to Pasadena the way it always does, quietly, without the drama of seasons that actually change, just a slight softening of the light and the smell of someone's fireplace 2 houses down, and the citrus trees in the backyard holding their fruit like they had all the time in the world. Samuel had retrieved the watch from the table at the Biltmore the night of the gala after the room had emptied. He drove it to me the following morning, set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and said only that it was where it belonged. I put it on my wrist, and I have not taken it off since. Lily and I had been in the new house for 3 months. She had chosen the color for her room herself, a pale yellow, the color of the dress we had left on the porch in August. I had not pointed that out to her. Some things you let a child decide without commentary. We were baking on a Saturday morning when the gate bell rang. Lily looked up from the bowl where she had been pressing her thumb into dough with the focused attention she brought to all important work. "I'll get it," she said, and was already sliding off the stool before I could answer. I watched through the kitchen window. Diane was at the gate. She was thinner than she had been in August. Her hair not quite as arranged, her coat, the expensive one she saved for occasions when she needed people to believe things were still going well. She was holding a white pastry box with both hands. Lily opened the gate and looked at her grandmother. "Hi," Lily said. Diane held out the box. "I brought you something." Lily looked at the box. Then she looked up at Diane with the clear, uncomplicated gaze of a child who remembers everything and has decided what to do with what she remembers. "That's nice," Lily said. "Grandpa and I made cookies this morning. His are really good." She paused. "He says cookies are only worth making for people you actually want to make them for." Diane did not say anything. Lily looked at her for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back up the path toward the house, her small shoulders straight. Franklin tucked under one arm. I met her at the door and held it open. She came inside and climbed back onto her stool and pressed her thumb into the dough again, humming something low and tuneless content. I closed the door. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked out at the garden, the citrus trees, the turned soil where the bulbs were waiting underground For spring, the late afternoon light coming in low and gold the way it does in December in Southern California, making everything look briefly and precisely like itself. I thought about my father's watch now, back on my wrist, where it belonged, the familiar weight of it, the way it caught the light when I moved. I thought about the elm tree on Ellendale Place that I would not see again, and the porch where I had knelt in August, and the 7 words I had sent Samuel from a parked car, and how all of it had led here to this kitchen, this garden, this child humming on her stool. I sat beside my granddaughter. She looked up from the dough cheeks, flushed from the warmth of the oven, a small smear of flour on her chin, and she smiled at me. The way she always smiled, without reservation, without qualification. The full and uncomplicated smile of someone who knows exactly where she is and is glad to be there. Outside December, light lay quiet on the garden. The citrus trees held their fruit. Somewhere 2 houses down, someone's fireplace was still going. We finished what we had started. There is something I have learned from all of this. Something I could not have told you at the beginning of this story, because I had not yet lived through the end of it. Strength is not what you do when someone is watching. It is what you do in the hallway outside your granddaughter's room at midnight, when no one is watching, when your hands want to shake, and you decide they will not. I am not a perfect man. I stayed quiet for too long. I saw things I chose not to name because naming them would have required me to act, and acting would have changed everything, and I was not ready for everything to change. Don't be like me in that. Don't wait until a child is crying on a porch before you decide that something matters enough to protect. My personal belief, and I say this as a man who has lost a great deal and found himself still standing, is that the people who strip others down to nothing are the loneliest people in any room. I have seen it now. I know it to be true. God has a way of returning to you what was always yours. Not always the way you expected, but always in time. This has been a grandpa story, one family story I never planned to tell. But if this grandpa story reached something in, you leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you want more family stories like this, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements created for reflection and perspective. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what feeds your soul.